So, welcome to the Coase Institute webinar on the institutional economics of homesteading. I'm Mary Shirley, in case you've gotten me already, and I am the president of the Ronald Coase Institute. We're very excited to welcome Doug Allen and Bryan Leonard to present their new book, Why the Rush? An Institutional Economic Analysis of Homesteading in the Settlement of the West. Doug is Burnaby Mountain Professor of Economics at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. And Bryan is Associate Professor of Environmental and Natural Resource Economics at the University of Wyoming. So this volume that they're going to present today is the culmination of their years of research on property rights in general and on homesteading in particular. And I know when I read the manuscript, I was blown away by their incredibly rich and novel data set, as well as the years of hard work and extensive analysis that went into this volume. Our discussant today is Nick Parker, who's professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his research analyzes various aspects of property rights and markets on environmental and natural resource policies. So he's very well suited to discuss this volume. Because of the number of us, we ask that you ask questions throughout the presentation by using the chat function. Please type your questions or comments into the chat function, not into the Q&A option. That way, after Nick's comments, Alexandra Benham, who is a part of our faculty and secretary to the board of the Ronald Coase Institute, and Lee Benham, who is also faculty and director of the Coase Institute, will pose your questions and comments to the authors, and we think we can maximize the number of comments. I should say that this is the first lecture from our book series with Cambridge University Press, and it's going to feature future volumes as well that will synthesize the rich results and patterns that we see emerging from a growing body of research on institutional economics. So look for in your emails for future invitations to other presentations of new manuscripts as they come out the pipeline. Finally, let me conclude this introduction by saying, as always, we welcome your support. We depend upon it. It gives us great encouragement and enables us to assist more young scholars and encourage more research on critical issues. You can always provide support for our work of any amount at our website by clicking on the donate button. That's www.coase.org. So let me turn the floor over to our two authors and speakers, starting, I guess, with Doug. So Doug, please.
Thank you very much. I guess on behalf of Bryan and myself, we're very grateful for this opportunity, and thanks to the Coase Institute, and thank you everybody for showing up. I know everybody's got great demands on their time. I'm just going to introduce the book. Bryan's going to talk about one chapter in particular. I think I'll start by just mentioning, when I first started working on homesteading over 35 years ago, I had access only to the aggregate number of homesteaders by state. I remember running a regression with 26 observations, and that was about as sophisticated as it got. There were questions I could not answer, so many that I could not answer, and there were so many questions that I couldn't even begin to ask because the information just wasn't available to even ask the questions. About 2000, around the year 2000, Ancestry.com started to digitize all the data, the land patent records, the millions of them that had been sitting in boxes for decades in DC. Those were made available about 2013, and around that time, Bryan and I independently started working with them. We met each other in 2018 and started working together, and like Mary said, this book is the culmination of all that work. The book, however, is not just a stapling together of the work that we've done. First thing I'd like to say about the book is we've tried to write what we think is a comprehensive analysis of the homesteading period. It's comprehensive in terms of the time period. We write from 1862 until it ended in 1934. Almost everyone who's written about homesteading, including the historians, writes before 1890 and misses, in fact, the largest period of homesteading. We're comprehensive across space. most of the people that write about homesteading write about it in terms of what happened on the Great Plains, and that makes some sense. It was very intensive and large there, but homesteading took place in the South. Homesteading took place, of course, in Oklahoma, but after 1890. Uh, Homesteading was very important in California, Arizona, Washington State. We look at all of these places. And we also look at Canada, which was an intensive and large era of homesteading, and just as important. It's comprehensive in that it also looks at the interaction of homesteading with railroad land grants. Um, it's comprehensive in that we drill down and worry about the actual logistics of how it took place. It's easy to think that homesteading, the government set aside these lands for homesteading, these lands for sales, etc. But generally speaking, that was not the case, that all lands were open up. And it was the actual logistics that gave homesteading a comparative and absolute advantage in particular types of lands. Um, we've tried to make it more comprehensive in terms of our theory and our framework so that we can actually include land sales. We can actually analyze the selection effects. We can analyze how things like railroad land grants, etc., interacted. Our analysis is also extremely fine-grained. So we drill down to the quarter section level, and we can make distinctions between plots and patents. So I might have got a homestead patent of 160 acres, but I might have been given to me in two 80-acre plots. And of course, we can georeference and connect those plots with the census, with any other kind of georeferenced data. So that's the first thing I want to get across is we've tried to make the most comprehensive analysis of homesteading. The book is organized in 4 sections. It goes from being fairly simple to I'd say quite sophisticated in its analysis. So it starts off with just sort of what we call homesteading fundamentals, which basically just covers the facts. We sort of show what happens over time across space, but also we drill down again at take Montana and sort of look at sort of basic facts of Montana. We have our basic theory of homesteading, which is that it goes back to the original theory in 91, was that homesteading was a way for the state to establish meaningful economic property rights over the frontier, or if you want to think of that as a type of sovereignty over the frontier in light of threats from the outside. Next, we look at these 3 periods of homesteading, looking at homesteading during the Civil War, the existential crisis of the U.S., the worry of the South over them taking over the bottom part of the U.S. Homesteading was then used as a part of Reconstruction, and there was a particular homesteading act directed at the South. Then we look at the early homesteading period and the role of railroads. And chapter 6, I think, is a huge contribution, looking at this late period of homesteading and how homesteading was used as a way of dispossessing the tribes of treaty lands that they had negotiated earlier in the century. Third part of the book looks at these 2 special cases. Oklahoma stands alone because they had these land races, I should say. And then Canada. Canada is a very interesting case. The U.S. has this crisis with the Civil War, but that caused a crisis for Britain with British North America, and Canada was really created as a response, really, out of the Civil War, and there was a possibility that U.S. would take over Canada in the late 1860s, and then for the next several decades, there was a huge possibility that the American squatters would de facto take over the rest of the country, and homesteading was used to thwart that. And then finally, we look at these long run implications. And chapter 9 is sort of work that Brian and I had done in the past. We extend it to Canada, etc. But chapter 10, this is where Brian's going to take over, provides a new definition of the frontier, a definition that's not based on just population density, but on the tenuous nature of property rights on the frontier. And I think I'll turn it over to Brian at that point just to talk about that.
Great. Thanks, Doug, and thank you to Mary and to the Coase Institute for supporting the book. And really huge thanks to Doug. It's been a pleasure of working on this project and the suite of projects over the last, I guess, 6 years or so. And then in the context of putting the book together in particular, I've learned a lot from Doug. And so that's been really, really fun. As Doug said, there's a few places in the book where we really make kind of new contributions that aren't drawing on anything we had previously done. So a lot of these chapters are kind of pulling on papers that we've previously written. But one thing that is really, really brand new is thinking about the relationship between homesteading and the frontier and some recent work in economics and political science, thinking about the significance of the frontier in American culture. So I'm going to try to keep this to 10 minutes, but I think this is one of the aspects of the book that we're jointly most excited about. So as Doug said, the thesis of the book, which has been Doug's thesis since the early 90s, is that homesteading really was integral to advancing the frontier. And part of that story is that the economic behavior of homesteaders themselves was very different than folks who were heading out west and purchasing land. That was kind of the whole point. We also provide some evidence along the way in the book, some new evidence that homesteaders themselves were different than people who were buying land on the frontier. They tended to be wealthier, they were more likely to be farmers, and they were subject to different constraints because of the requirements of the Homestead Act. So this work and this idea that homesteading is pushing the frontier forward to help the U.S. assert its economic property rights is closely related to really an explosion of recent literature and economic history that previously hadn't been in conversation with our work. So there's this paper by Sam Bozzi and co-authors in 2020, where they purport to measure what's called total frontier experience. So think about how long a county was on the frontier and how that impacted a culture of rugged individualism in the American West. And the basic thesis of that paper is that, or they show in that paper, that more individualistic people tended to move to the frontier. And once getting there, they became even more individualistic. And here individualism is being measured by whether you name your children something unique. So in that paper, they also show that counties that had more exposure to the frontier, and we'll talk about that measure in a moment, tended to exhibit preferences for smaller government, even in the modern era. So this is really a paper about cultural persistence. So they're saying the frontier begat a particular culture of individualism, and that shows up in political preferences and policies today. Since that original 2020 paper, there's been this explosion of work, basically regressing total frontier experience, or I'll start referring to it as TFE for short, on any outcome you can imagine, from COVID policy to gender norms to climate policy. But to date, until this chapter, there was literally zero mention of the word homesteading in any of these papers, despite the fact that there's broadly this notion that the availability of free land is precisely what was drawing individualists to the frontier. So the research questions that we ask in this chapter, and then in, I think, ongoing work that's going to go beyond what managed to make it into the book, is what is the relationship between the frontier and homesteading over time? What can we say quantitatively about that? And given that dynamic process, which I'll characterize here in a moment, how does the overall extent of homesteading in a place relate to this measure of TFE created by Bozzi and co-authors? And then finally, once we have these two things side by side, we can ask, do homesteading and frontier experience have independent effects on individualistic culture and modern outcomes? So I'm going to try to go through this really quickly because I promised Mary I would only take 10 minutes. But basically, the way to think about this is that Bozzi and co-authors take a very precise but ultimately pretty arbitrary definition of the frontier and operationalize it using new data. So this goes all the way back to Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, where he says that the frontier is the place where we go from having more than 2 people per square mile to less than 2 people per square mile. So Bozzi and co-authors are going to find that line in every single decade based on census data at the county level, and then they're going to identify counties that are close to that line or not and call those frontier counties. They're going to add that up over time and create this specific cross-sectional measure at the county level. That's how long did you spend on the frontier. Here's what that looks like in their main estimating sample. These are just places that, for idiosyncratic reasons, either were settled very quickly and so had very little frontier experience, or were settled more slowly and so spent a longer time kind of on the fringe of society or on the fringe of where there's more people living. So the first thing we do in chapter 10 is we ask, how does homesteading relate to the frontier over time? And this is a complicated looking graph, but I'll try to make it simple. We're basically just going to ask the question, how many people show up, whether they're homesteaders or folks buying land? Are they more or less likely to show up in places that are just behind the frontier or just beyond the frontier? So we do this in a regression discontinuity framework, but the basic point is both buyers of land and homesteaders prefer to go just a little bit beyond the frontier as opposed to trying to claim land where there's already relatively high population density. But homesteaders are much more willing to go further past the frontier. The number of people claiming land drops much more dramatically for buyers than for homesteaders. So this is some initial evidence, some new evidence that homesteaders actually are the ones that are moving out beyond the frontier of where people are currently living. We can also think about that sort of more about this idea of how long does a county spend on the frontier. So we use a duration model that basically asks the question, what is the probability that a county goes from being beyond the frontier to being fully settled and behind the frontier in a given decade? And we illustrate in the book that a new arrival of many homesteaders dramatically increases the probability that the county is no longer on the frontier. That's what you're seeing on the left is basically the effect of a 2 standard deviation increase in the number of homesteads in a given decade. Whereas having a bunch of cash purchasers show up really doesn't move the needle at all in terms of how quickly the frontier is progressing, which is what you're seeing on the right-hand side. So again, this is brand new quantitative evidence that actually, consistent with Doug's 1991 thesis, homesteaders are actually doing what the state is hoping they're doing. They're moving the frontier forward. They're helping it to advance. So this tees up another question, which is, if we think about kind of trying to compress these two dynamics that I just showed you into a cross-sectional measure that's going to summarize similarly to TFE at the county level, how much homesteading happened. So we're just going to think about what's the total intensity of homesteads, what share of claims in a county were homesteads up through 1890. How is that going to relate to this cross-sectional measure of total frontier experience, how much time a county spent on the frontier? And we argue in the book that relationship could really go either way and that it's ultimately an empirical question. When we look at it in the data using the sort of set of controls that Bozzi and co-authors prefer in their paper, we find a positive relationship between homesteading and this measure of frontier exposure. So places that were more intensely homesteaded also have greater total frontier experience, and the correlation or the slope on that line is about 0.46. But importantly, there's a lot of residual variation there. So we then ask the question, does homesteading have an impact on individualistic culture that is independent of this notion of frontier experience, or is it all about how much time you spent on the frontier? And similarly, we ask whether the relationship that Bozzi and his co-authors document is really more about homesteading, or is once you control for homesteading, is there still an effect of this notion of frontier experience on the outcomes that they consider? I want to blaze through a couple of graphs very quickly to kind of take you to the conceptual wrap up at the end. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to re-estimate the main specifications from Bozzi's paper and a couple other papers, simply adding our homestead controls. So we're sort of relying on their empirical framework and adding this measure of homesteading intensity. So we're going to look at this historical measure of individualism, which is just, did people name their children something unique? We're going to look at modern political preferences, and then we're going to look at modern income mobility. So in terms of historical individualism, the basic finding here is that the effect of homesteading on individualism is about twice as large as the effect of frontier experience, although both remain significant predictors of individualism circa 1940. When we fast forward to the modern era and look at political preferences for things like cutting public spending on welfare programs or tax cuts or county level property rates or Republican vote share, we find that the effect of homesteading on basically what Bozzi and co-authors call anti-statist or small government preferences, that those two things look pretty similar. They operate independent of one another, but they're of sort of the same order of magnitude. And we find something similar when we look at modern measures of income mobility. So places that spent longer on the frontier actually exhibit greater upward mobility in terms of earnings today, as do places that were more intensely homesteaded. So to sort of take stock of all that, which I realized was very quick, total frontier experience, TFE, and homestead intensity are positively correlated, conditional on geography. And they're independently related to measures of individualism, preferences for smaller government, and economic mobility. And so this really tees up the question, what does the residual variation in TFE actually measure after we've conditioned on our measure of homesteading? And conversely, what does the residual variation in homesteading tell us that's different from the measure of the frontier? I should say that is essentially where we end the chapter in the book, and then we pose a series of questions around this, around what are the differential mechanisms through which homesteading has an influence on sort of frontier culture or individualistic culture that seems to persist into the modern era, and what can looking at homesteading in particular, as opposed to just population density, tell us? And so this has led us to think a little bit more broadly, and maybe I'll leave this as a teaser here, but the notion of the frontier that Doug and I have in the book that's really operational throughout really focuses on economic property rights, i.e. the ability to control and enjoy the benefits of the use of an asset, in this case, land. So for us, the frontier is a place where economic property rights are weak and resources must be expended to defend those rights. This is actually very different than what's going on in Bozzi. They're building on Turner's definition, which is all about population density, which is a measure of social ties and perhaps remoteness from society and other institutions. So for them, the frontier is actually a place that's characterized by social isolation, not necessarily by weak property rights, though it may have implications for weak property rights. So I'll leave this, and you can tell Doug made this figure because it's got Canadian cities on it. But basically, this has led us to think about sort of two different ways of defining the frontier and how they may or may not overlap. So you could imagine a continuum of how socially isolated a place is. And so you could have a place with very few people, or you could have a dense urban area. And that may operate independently. We think it does operate independently of how strong property rights are. So you could have a place with no economic property rights or a place with perfect property rights. Bozzi and co-authors are only focused on the vertical axis. We want to focus on some combination of the vertical and horizontal axis, noting that social isolation is not the same thing as weak property rights. So if you take this sort of census definition of the frontier that Bozzi worked with and fast forward, it turns out most of Eastern Montana and Wyoming are still on the frontier according to their definition. But this is clearly something very different than what Frederick Jackson Turner had in mind when he's writing about the significance of frontier in American culture, where he's really talking about the need for folks to band together and defend their property rights, essentially. So I'll skip that slide and I'll try to leave off here. But really what this has motivated us to do is to think about moving forward, using kind of building on our prior work to use the land patent data to build a new definition of the frontier that's really grounded in our economic theory of homesteading and the economic theory of property rights, instead of using population density as a proxy. And then that's really starting to stretch beyond what we've done in the book. So I think I'll leave it there. And if there's questions about this, I'd be happy to chat about it a little bit more. But this has been a really fun opportunity to think about how some of the work we've been engaged in over the last 6 years relates to this other previously siloed conversation that's been going on in economic history.
Hey, thanks very much, Brian. It's fascinating. So our next speaker is Nick, who's going to comment on the book. So please, Nick, take it away.
Thank you. This is a great book. It's well written. I find it interesting. I find it convincing. I thought I was informed before reading it. I consider myself pretty knowledgeable of at least the economic history of U.S. land policy, of property rights, and of political economy of American Indian policy, which the book touches on all of these. But I learned so much from reading it and realized how much I didn't know about homesteading in particular, and the settlement of the U.S. West in general. So this is of clear interest to scholars of settlement, of colonization, and of conflict. I think it's also should be recommended reading for students of history, of law, economics, political science, geography, and land and natural resource policy, just to name a few. The team of authors, so that's Doug and Brian, is a fantastic example of, I would say, full exploitation in the most complementary sense of comparative advantage and gains from trade. So as Professor Allen was saying, he began his study of homesteading 35 years ago. Brian was probably not yet running regressions unless he was particularly
Very
precocious. But Doug is an excellent writer. He's astute at communicating complex ideas to broad audiences, and this book is a clinic in that. Professor Leonard is an astute data analyst, among other things, but he really knows how to present complex data in simple and digestible and informative ways. And you see that throughout the book. I mean, millions of observations, new data set, but these graphs are really special in the way that they can deliver a punchline and really not get, the authors are not getting lost, losing the forest from the trees in the data analysis. So both of these scholars think deeply about property rights and economic history. This is on full display in the book. It's evident in the engaging stories they tell. They launch with the story of Dr. Allen's ancestors who were homesteaders in Canada. There's engaging stories about politicians who played a role in this process, case studies of specific areas like Oklahoma, Montana, Alaska. And it's really also evident, their scholarship is evident in the detailed and careful empirical work, as I alluded to above, which always delivers interesting punchlines. So I want to say this book is the definitive analysis of something broader than the title implies, which is really the causes and the consequences of settlement in the West. Both have been studied before, but not with the meticulous detail or care that's in this book. It really becomes, because of this care they put into the study, it becomes an institutional economic analysis, which is in the title, but that's really just longhand. I'd say that's longhand for saying thorough and original analysis. So to do this well, you have to understand the economic institutions at play, and they do. And this, this is a new contribution in that regard, in a lot of different ways. But one way I'll highlight is an example from the book in chapter 6. So chapter 6 is describing how railroad land grants complemented homesteading policies, and they can't really be analyzed independent of each other. But economic historians have analyzed railroad grants in isolation, not considering how they relate to homesteading. And this includes the great Nobel Prize winner, Robert Fogel. And, he missed the obvious question that's discussed in chapter 6, which is, why do you have this costly rush to build railroads into the hinterlands of the American West? Why would you allow that rush? There's so much waste. But that question wasn't asked. And if you did ask that question, you would ask, were the railroad land grants related to homesteading? And Allen and Leonard tell you they're very much dependent on each other. It's a fascinating part of the book in chapter 6. So in my mind, the book delivers 4 main arguments. The first is what Brian was just discussing, and I think a really powerful point that's going to get a lot of attention in the coming years. But the frontier is a place of weak economic property rights, fundamentally. That's what the frontier is. I think that's a very compelling and general definition of the frontier, and it likely is going to apply to unexplored natural resources, unexplored places, perhaps in outer space. This is a great way to think of the frontier. So second argument in the book is that it was not the movement of troops that secured the American West, but the movement of people. Sovereignty was accomplished in the 19th and early 20th century through the use of homesteading augmented by these railroad land grants. I'd say it in simpler terms. Homesteading privatized security at a time and in areas where state capacity was very weak. It outsourced security to settlers who were encouraged to make these sunken capital investments. They made the sunk investments, they're encouraged to, and then they had incentives to defend them. So there's many details in the book on why different terms were chosen in the homesteading laws to make incentives, to create incentives for people to quickly settle areas where sovereignty was weak and where there was big benefits to privatizing this security. So in this narrative, homesteading was an institution that uniquely addressed the state capacity problem, and the gains to the states, I think it's implied in the book, not explicitly stated, but the gains of the state exceeded the costs of racing. The third main argument of the book is that the homesteading process, the institutions, the homesteading institutions is what they refer to them as, selected a certain type of settler. Think Pa Ingalls from the Little House on the Prairie, if you might, if you remember that show. But this selection process endogenously minimized the economic waste from racing. So it selected individuals with a high tolerance for isolation. Those are the ones that would go out into the frontier first. And it selected individuals wanting to farm and willing and ready and able and interested in investing in that lifestyle, which gave you the sunk investments. The fourth argument is that homesteading, relative to real alternatives like selling the land with on cash terms, has had these long-term effects that Brian was discussing at the end of his comments, or in his comments, and long-term effects on land values, modern culture, and economic mobility. Land values because of path dependence. You invest in agriculture early, and then there's these lower valued uses of the land, and transitioning out of them is maybe more costly than developing vacant land, and so these differences in land value persist. Implications for culture measured in part by individualism, and implications potentially for economic mobility, which seems to be linked to individualism. So the linkage here might be homesteading, led to a selection process on the frontier, that these were individualistic people who had a tolerance for living on this frontier. And then in the long run, this had implications for economic mobility, because individualism can be a human capital asset, apparently. So I love the book. I think some of the insights can apply to explaining why grandfathering might be an efficient institution for granting and securing property rights to natural resources, such as rights to fisheries. This definition of the frontier will help. I don't have time to discuss that today. I want to end with just two questions that the book raised for me, and that I did not see the answer to those questions. And Professor Allen and Leonard are welcome to answer these questions, or get back with me later. But there's two questions that came up in my mind. The one question is narrow, and I wonder if there's something about the security of title to land that differed ex post between cash sales and homesteading. So you bring up this point that you have different methods of acquiring title, and why would these methods matter, after title is acquired? And I wanted to ask, do the legal or social institutions of obtaining title give more credence to the property rights, the economic property rights, if they were acquired by investing in the resource versus acquired by purchase? And if so, I think it's further motivation for homesteading, another way to make economic property rights stronger. My broad question is that I think this whole book, the story paints homesteading institutions in a very favorable light. And I think implicitly, this gives a lot of credence to the US government for orchestrating it all. And this contrasts a bit with public choice views of government that suggest inefficient policies can be promoted and they can persist. So I wanted to ask, why were homesteading institutions so well designed? Thank you. Those are my comments.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Well, I asked everyone to ask questions via the chat function, and no one has done that. You're quite an unruly audience. So instead, what we're going to do is I'll ask Alexandra and Lee to take over and call on people who use the raise your hand function in the at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand.
Well, this is Lee here. First of all, this is a very exciting presentation. Nick, you've opened my eyes to some of the dimensions here. I would like to encourage you all to come up with some questions, but I have one that you've touched on. So what, more specifically, literatures should be, accept your arguments as given. Right now, not to dispute the arguments, just take them as given. What specific changes in what literature should flow from that? Obviously, the frontier discussion is there, but the whole issue of insecure property rights is vast, and you've given thought to it. So I'd be interested if Doug and Brian would have some thoughts about who should pay attention to this.
Your question is what literature should pay attention to the book? Is that your question is? Or the argument in the book? Is that, Lee, your question? Your mic is turned off.
You're muted now.
You're muted, Lee.
Sorry about that. You have come to some conclusions here about this dynamic, and it's interesting in itself. The issue, what I'm asking here is the kind of permutation, the penetration of this argument in other areas. We talk about fisheries and space, but you would know more.
So maybe I'll answer your question and maybe Nick's second question at the same time, because they're sort of related, and maybe Brian can pipe in. Brian said, how does this relate to the public choice, which thinks that, all the state actions are inefficient? So I would say that might be the first place other literature should pay attention. If you see something that has been lasting for decades or centuries, then we should have the presumption that it's probably doing something correctly. I mean, that was the very first thing that when Yoram and I first started talking about homesteading in the 1980s, we recognized that, okay, this was obviously a way of transferring title from the state to individuals, but they already knew how to do that through sales. And this creates this gap where the state has title, places it in the public domain, and then the title is captured by somebody. We thought that's crazy, just like everybody else thought it was crazy. But our next question was, but it lasted for, at least 60, 70 years. So it couldn't have been that crazy. And it was copied in Canada. So in Canada, they have a debate, and they're sort of saying, maybe we should, instead of having 160 acres like the US, maybe we should make it 200. Instead of charging a $10 registration fee, maybe it should be $5. And somebody literally stands up in the House of Commons and says, the only thing we know is that worked. What they did in the US worked, and we're going to copy it. So first off, there should be this presumption that it did work. To answer more directly Nick's point, I think what helped here was both the US and Britain had an existential crisis. I mean, really, the country could literally disappear. And they had a strong incentive to find something that would work. And in Canada, especially, they knew that the country might not even come into existence, and if it did, it could easily be taken over. And they knew they needed occupation, and that's what homesteading fundamentally was. It's rushed occupation, and so they were able to design something quite simply that captured that.
Yeah, excuse me. I think to answer Lee's question specifically, in addition to the points that Nick made about some applications to natural resources, two other literatures come to mind. One is the development economics literature. Been trying to find statistics on this for a number of years now and haven't been able to nail it down. But I think that it is true that there are a number of homestead-like land titling programs still happening around the world today. There are a lot of places where in developing contexts where transferring formal title to land is an ongoing process, right? It's not a historical process. And I think those programs tend to have homestead-like features, so occupation requirements, improvement requirements, these types of things. And so I think they're even though it's a book about economic history, I think there are actually some policy implications for land titling in the developing world. The other one that this may be a slightly more controversial claim is what I'll call Cambridge-style economic history of the American West, which tends to treat things like the railroad or movements of people as these totally exogenous shocks that can be studied. And I think the Bozzi paper, I don't want to pick on that paper too much. I've talked to Sam a lot about our chapter, and he's been really great to dialogue with about it and is really interested in what we're doing. But that paper is an example of something where, there are very broad claims being made about what's happening and literally no discussion of the basic institutions that are bringing people out to the frontier. And I think there's a lot of work like that going on in economic history. And so I think fleshing out the institutional details is really important for being careful in making big claims about what we can learn from historical episodes and how general it is.
PJ has a question.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go ahead and call on people. So PJ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, a couple of questions. Doug, I think you've answered my kind of question about the security question. When you say about the homesteading was an act of securing claims, and was the concern just over the boundary between Canada and the US? I mean, it seems to me that got settled fairly early, and the Oregon Treaty in 1846, homesteading really is going on for a long period. So that strikes me as kind of a long period in which the homesteaders are trying to add to U.S. security, and I'm not quite convinced by that. I'm more convinced that I was 20 years ago by your work. But then the second question is the economic waste question, that has come up for a long time in homesteading. If you look at 1920, it would appear that there's just too many people on the plains and they have to be moved off. So you look all across the Great Plains and population peaks in 1920 in many places on the plains, and people start moving off. So it would seem to be maybe a misallocation of resources. Is that just an information problem? To what extent is homesteading responsible for economic waste by putting too many people in a situation that you'd kind of call inappropriate agriculture for the low rainfall plains?
So nowhere in the book do we deny the fact that homesteading is costly. And nowhere do we deny that, it encourages in all kinds of ways people to engage in activities that they otherwise may not have done. So what we don't say is that it was wasteful, because we're saying there was some offsetting benefit. So I think it's chapter 7 again. As I briefly mentioned, the bulk of homesteading takes place after 1895.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are this massive amount of people that are dumped into especially the Montana, North South Dakota areas, Northwest Nebraska, in the early 20th century. And why did they do that? And what we argue in the book is this was a way of dispossessing the natives of these lands permanently. So in the mid-19th century, the U.S. government makes treaties with the Lakota, the Sioux, the Comanche, etc., and they give them massive territories. 3 tribes got 90%, an area 90% the size of Texas, and they had, in 1860, they had 70,000 people. Just think about that for a second. 1880 comes along, and the U.S. wants those lands back, but they've made treaties, and the tribes won't negotiate. And so what do? Through the allotment acts, they take it back, confiscate it, basically. They know they're going to be sued. They are sued immediately. So how do they prevent these lands from ever going back? They just throw literally hundreds of thousands of people on those lands, get them building, get them farming, etc., effectively forcing the courts to determine a price for the land. So yeah, did it put a lot of people, waste people in eastern Montana and northeastern Montana to go farming in areas they shouldn't? Yeah. But that was the way they kept the lands of the Sioux from reverting back. Now you can say there was a tremendous injustice, etc., but that was what was going on.
Okay. John Nye, I think, has been patiently waiting, and then Chen Gang. John?
Hi, excuse me for not having the video. I'm having problems of my own with my computer, so uh, you'll be spared looking at my mug while I ask this question. So, I mean, I'm really interested in this subject. I really think this is a great book. I don't really know much about the frontier except for the Turner work and the Eleanor Ostrom paper based around an early articles on homesteading in, I believe, the first year of the American Economic Review. So, however, one thing that I think Doug is being too sanguine about is the assumption of persistence. And in particular, you want to ask the question, I think you're conflating the success of homesteading early with its persistence in the Anglo-American world. That is, the best examples about the persistence of some variety of homesteading seem to be the US, Canada, and Australia. In contrast, in much of the world, homesteading does not lead to rugged individualism or to kind of any kind of decentrality, decent in the long run, because they're all grabbed back in one form or another. A very good contrast is Russia. Russia took half of its eastern possessions after conflict with China in 1860. And as people may or may not know that half of the sort of the eastern Siberian half of Russia comes from China. And Russia rushes to populate those areas, such as the Amur region, by giving away lands, not simply, but sort of giving huge numbers of grants and making it possible for outsiders like persecuted religious minorities to move there. And they take one step further too, instead of trying to dispossess the remaining Chinese there, in the same way the U.S. did with the Indians, the Russians literally ordered them out of what was now Russian China at the end of the 19th century. Since then, there's been no tradition of Russian individualism because the Russians have explicitly centralized their power so that, say, Vladivostok, which should be the equivalent of San Francisco for Russia, is never permitted to grow. In fact, no cities outside of Moscow and Petersburg are ever allowed to challenge Moscow and Petersburg. And Lee knows from work of our own students in various seminars that to this day, there are all sorts of bureaucratic rules designed to funnel commercial activity through Moscow or Peter and limiting the extent to which outlying areas can be permitted to be as decentralized even as Xiamen is from Beijing in China. So, and I would argue that's the norm rather than the mean. That is, where you see persistence is where you have strong federalism, strong straight rights, and an Anglo notion that private property rights should be preserved, and there are laws to fight attempts by the government to just take them over wholesale. I wonder what you have to say about that.
I'll just briefly respond. Brian can respond. In a sense, I don't really disagree with you. So yes, whether it's called homesteading or not, there are policies all around the world where states try to rush occupation. I mean, even right now, Russia's trying to rush occupation into eastern Ukraine, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens after that is going to critically depend on all the institutional details of how that is put into play. And it's also going to critically depend on all the institutional context in which that's also taking place. So, have a particular type of long run persistence will depend on these particular details. And I would never think that, Russia's conquest of Siberia would necessarily have to match the American conquest of the West.
But if I may just add quickly, Doug, the point you're making is that you're assigning causality to the homesteading and rugged individualism. I'm arguing that it's the homesteading combined with the initial degree of individualistic and federal preserving institutions that's driving it. Since homesteading is in some form or another, is far more common around the world than in the most successful areas, I don't see any evidence that it's the peculiarities of American homesteading per se. It's more the peculiarities of the Americans' willingness to allow mineral rights and other things, not just relating to homesteading, but even the way in which state mineral rights are not nationalized, or that the federal government doesn't interfere in a regulatory fashion in ways that promote either a small cabal of centralized cronies or of nationalism that leads to this.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very interesting point. Like Brian mentioned, this is sort of really on the fringe for us. I mean, this is the edge of where our research is this issue. So yeah, I take your point.
Yeah, just real quickly. Thanks, John. I really appreciate that. And I think that's a great point. I think the way we were thinking about it in the chapter is really thinking about which places within the US are more or less individualistic. And so it's all kind of conditioned on the same set of underlying background institutions. But I think you're absolutely right that the way Bozzi and co-authors frame their study, and particularly a newer kind of follow-up paper that's just a working paper at this point, is trying to explain the particular features of American individualism and assign the explanation to that to something about frontierism or the frontier. And I'm not sure that we're ready to make a claim. I don't think we're trying to make a claim like that, but that your point's really well taken, that we need to be really careful in how we think about characterizing that.
Okay, Chenggang.
Right. Yeah, my question is about your way of defining property rights. Either you call that as very weak, or you call that perfect. So empirically, concretely, how these are measured. And also when you talked about intention or the purpose or institution of homesteading, you mentioned that so this started from the place where the property rights is very weak or absent, and then the purpose is to establish property rights together with sovereignty. But then the issue is, since you have been looking at a long historical time series, so how the property rights are evolved. So that's a part of the reason why I'm asking about how these are measured. So empirically, how these are measured, and by using your measurement, how these are evolved so how that's associated with this particular type of allocating property rights. And also when Doc talked about the certain states later on, the government change mind and renegotiate the land being allocated previously. So then immediately that is actually related to this question. So if people anticipate this kind of a renegotiation or changing mind of the government. So that how the property rights is measured.
Right. That's a big question. So, I mean, a fundamental distinction in the book and going all the way back to Alchin and all these sorts of things is there's a distinction between legal property rights, your ability under the law to make decisions, and your economic property rights, your actual ability to make decisions. And so, in terms of the history of the US, the federal government laid claim legally to, the frontier, the what's now the 48 states. But at any given time, you can ask, to what extent were they able to make a choice with respect to that? To what extent were they able to sell land? Were they able to lay down a track, etc.? Now you're asking, how do you measure that? That's a huge question, and one I really can't answer, but with much difficulty and probably not very successfully. But you can tell situations that are worse or not. We view property rights as a spectrum, not just 1 or 0. That this ability to make choices can be completely absent or in principle perfect. And you're right that when the U.S. transferred legal title to lands to tribes in 1850, and then when it revokes that in 1880, that's an indication that the economic rights of those tribes was weak, right? That those rights were taken away. I'm not quite sure how to answer that more, other than, what the book is trying to do is trying to say, can we operationalize this concept of property rights in the context of this homesteading? And I think the answer is yes, we can, but it's not easy and it's quite complicated.
So there's one more question, and the time's about up, from Henry Mormon, who asks you, have you considered looking at the religious preferences of homesteaders in your studies? For example, isolated families might prefer more individualistic religious faiths. Have you looked at that at all?
So we connect our data to the U.S. Historical Census. Unfortunately, the two things: one, the matching isn't that great, and two, the historical census, as I recall, doesn't have anything about religious preferences, at least in the 1880s. So I don't think we have that data.
I think it's available in some years. We should at least look into it and confirm. I've seen some maps, which makes me think it's in the census somewhere. Yeah. It's not something we've done, but we should look into it. I think that would be very interesting.
I grew up on the frontier in Texas. In fact, the county was called the Last Frontier, and Texas is sort of different because of the history there. But one of the local laws were, and I would guess this would show up, is that certain ethnic groups, certain immigrant groups did much better. So the German immigrants just were better performing. I think Thomas Sowell's gotten into that. So I don't know quite what you do with it, but perhaps something.
Yeah, Texas is a fascinating state. Of course, there was no homesteading in Texas because, it joined the Union in a unique way and kept its public lands, and the federal government never had access to them. But
okay, there's another comment on the chat function, Alexandra.
Okay, yes, this is from Chris Brosna to everyone. One of the instances he thinks of are European trading companies sending people to populate their claims, like using the Huguenots to populate Acadia for France.
Yeah, there's lots. You can go back. I think in the conclusion of the book, we go all the way back to the Romans. The Romans using land grants to their centurions and they never put those land grants in Rome. They were always on the edge of the frontier with the barbarians. So using your population to establish sovereignty and control over a region is extremely common in history and across the world, just like what John was saying earlier. What's not common is to have it so institutionalized and formal as was the case in the US. That's what makes the US case so unique was the formality, the length of time, and the intense um, role of the federal state. I see there's another question that says, is there some potential for out of sampling? I consider the Canada case as completely out of sample. I mean, um, the hypothesis seems to explain, on the one hand, Canada copied the US, but on the other hand, they made marginal differences. And the marginal differences were directly related to the problem of squatters, American squatters. They were worried about American squatters in a particular zone, and they tried to flood that. They weren't so concerned with the density required to defend an area militarily. They were interested in flooding the zone generally, and to stop large groups of American squatters from settling on the prairies.
And then, John, does that answer your question, or if you want to say more?
Are you asking me or John Nye?
I'm asking you because he was responding to your chat.
Oh, no, that wasn't my question.
Oh, sorry.
But a great response. My question was for Doug. Really, I would welcome Brian's thoughts too.
Everybody's picking on me. I think they should pick more on Brian. Go ahead.
So you've made the case for this economic way of thinking and understanding behavior that a lot of people find counterintuitive or contrarian, and but really powerful. And there's often very little kind of room inside of that for culture as an explainer of behavior. And yet here you're saying that an institution that persisted for a long time but ended nearly 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, created all of these really long, persistent kind of cultural relics that we can trace back to it. And I'm just wondering, kind of from the economics perspective, how you would understand that phenomenon. Why would somebody who is a descendant of homesteaders behave differently today than someone who lives in a similarly isolated, rural, cold region, but doesn't have, that homesteading ancestry and in attitudes towards politics and individualism and all these things? Like, why wouldn't that sort of discriminating hypothesis or that institutional arrangement that is wealth maximizing net of transaction costs, why would suddenly culture enter into this in that way? So maybe just a little help understanding that way of thinking on those questions.
I've always been opposed to using culture as an explanation. I've never been opposed to culture as an outcome. So, we exist in a certain environment, and this leads to certain cultural traits. Those are things that require explaining. They are not, in my opinion, the explanation of what's going on. You say, I'll give you a funny story about how things might influence in culture. In my family, there's this famous story of my grandfather, who in 1960, he had been a homesteader on the absolute fringe, either the Bazzi definition or the Allen Leonard definition of the frontier. He's on the fringe. His daughter, he's like 80 years old now. His daughter comes and says, I bought this car and I think I got ripped off. And he goes into the back closet and grabs his gun and says, we're going to go down and renegotiate this deal. That was the world he lived in, was that, there's a bear out back. You got, you get your gun. You don't got a dispute with your neighbor. You bring your gun. I mean, he never shot anybody, but, that was the world he lived in. And that carries on to the day. I took my 13-year-old son out there one time, and my cousin said, what are you going to do? I know what you do here. And he showed him a rack of guns and said, here, take a gun and go shoot some stuff. So I can see how culture can be the outcome of the context in which you grew up in.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I would add to that I just want to be really careful about what we're doing when we talk about culture and homestead intensity. We are not tracking the descendants of homesteaders.
Right, correct.
I've got another project where we're trying to do that with Joe Price, but we are looking at outcomes in places that historically had a lot of homesteading versus places that historically didn't. And there's all sorts of, like, I would refer you to the work of like Alberto Bassin about thinking about what are the mechanisms of cultural transition. Is it parent to child? Is it your peers or whatever? But, and in particular, in thinking about some of the modern outcomes like economic mobility, it's literally like, even though you moved around as a kid, if you spent longer in a place that had more homesteading or had more frontier experience, you tend to be more upwardly mobile. And that actually raises more questions than it answers about why is that the case and what are the mechanisms behind that. And so in that analysis, yeah, as Doug said, we're not really using culture per se as an explanatory variable. It's more, okay, this historical set of institutions that was really prevalent in this place seems to still matter for people that are living or have lived in that place. And I think we're just scratching the surface of understanding why. But I'm hopeful that using the property rights approach to think about why will be more fruitful than just thinking about it from like a population density begets a particular type of culture type of story.
We really should wrap up soon.
Okay, I got a quickie, but a profoundly important question. What is the best movie to reflect your view of what went on the frontier?
Well, you know, I will only say this, I don't think it's a great movie, but Far and Away has this great scene where the parents, it's about the Oklahoma rush, the parents go out the night before and hide in the grass. And when the people are rushing out on their horses, they jump up and, you know, raise the flag. I mean, that's a great scene of a Sooner.
I might, instead of a movie, I'll answer with a show, and I'm going to say Deadwood, which I think does a really good job talking about informal versus formal institutions and how the state plays into that.
Great. So you have your reading list and your viewing list cut out for you. I let it run over a little bit, but I don't want to go on too much longer. But I'm going to conclude with a comment from our editor at Cambridge University Press that I think is a very nice comment. He says that the webinar has been very interesting. I always knew that this book was a great book when I commissioned it. This webinar has helped to confirm my first impression. We are very pleased to have it on the Cambridge Economics list, one of many great books we will be publishing with the Coase Institute in the coming years. So with that very positive note from Cambridge and also from our commentators and from our discussant, Nick Parker, I'd like to thank the two presenters for doing such a terrific job with a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. And I, like Nick, I thought I knew something going into reading it, and I was amazed at how much I learned. So let me encourage you, once the book is out, to please look it up and get it. And thank you again for your attendance. And as a reminder, we will be having more of these probably in 2025. So look in your email for invitations. Thank you again. And we're concluding the webinar now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye, Mary. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Cheng.